So, a part of me thinks that I'm going to keep myself in a bit more of a calmer and composed state for this video. The other half of me thinks that I'm going to emotionally blow up in a extensively aggressive whirlwind. I don't know which one of those is going to be more likely as I proceed along with this. Maybe it'll be a mix of the two. Actually, I'm hoping that it'll be of a more, or I'll finally be able to start getting a handle on displaying anger in a more composed manner. Something that I've been trying to practice for a long while now. I have been failing tremendously at it. But who knows? We'll see. So, what is this video? Well, simply put, it's a compilation of me just explaining things that from my analysis are nonsense, that are continuously present social myths that aren't true, that still prevail extensively, even in the most minor of ways. This whole video is just going to be an attempt to dispel them in any manner of speech. I was going to make maybe try to make a list, an actual written out list for me to just look over as bullet points for specific topics, specific beliefs that various people still hold en masse, just so that I would remember better to keep on track a bit more steadily. But I said fuck it. I didn't get around to that as of recent. And regardless, these things are constantly fresh in my mind anyway, so it's not going to be in any specific order. I'm just going to free throw it. I might pause the footage here and there just to gather my thoughts and go from there. So, what will be the first one? Well, in relation to me being a neuroscientist, let's go with this one. This one's always recurrent, probably in relation to all the intersectionality of everything. I guess this is overall the most recurrent that I see. Well, the myth that psychology is not only separate from physiology, but separate from all of the realms of scientific examination: sociology, philosophy, ideology, physics, theology, zoology, etc., which is a little malarkey. But to keep it, I guess, a bit more simplified, let's just go with specific relation to physiology and sociology. So, ever since the inception of psychological examination as a field of practice, there has been this unrealistic level of unjustified skepticism towards the validity of psychology as a whole. And it's only in very recent decades that its validity as a science, and more specifically as neuroscience, is being somewhat recognized, especially in the age of mass neoliberal fascism and performative activism. But in that regard, there are those who believe that your emotional state, how our emotional processes affect our social environments, is in a specific realm of human existence, and it doesn't at all connect to the physiological well-being of, well, human beings, specifically in relation to psychological disorders, that they have no play in how physiological disorders and diseases come about or manifest. Wrong. There is numerous evidence by this point, done mainly by independent scientific research organizations that aren't in it for capitalist profiteering or aren't just the puppets of private academia research-based companies or function within regulated post-secondary schooling systems, that there's numerous evidence that our psychological states, how our emotions function, not only, as far as I'm concerned, is a branch of the nervous system, is controlled by the central nervous system, or neurocortexes, but influences the very functioning of our autoimmune systems, how the properties of the autoimmune system actually protect the rest of the body structure, but also how the actual physiological properties that end up going into causing, or very much look like they could be the cause of, physiological disease, well, present themselves. Specifically, because of mass psychological disorder, actual physical deterioration in relation to gastrointestinal function, cardiological function, dermatological function, pulmonary function, proctological function, and sexological function, and further in that, andrological and gynecological function, how disorders in said fields come about. And in specific relation to said psychological distress causing the physiological damage, it is most often attributed to, from what these studies have shown, that of effects in relation to the immune system, as mentioned just previously. As immunocells that are meant to protect the body begin acting against the healthy physiological cells and actually causing dysfunction within them. Now, on a further basis than that, in regards to more non-immuno problematic functions because of emotional disrupt. Sorry, I'm by the Viz in Quebec City Harbor. In relation to disrupt, most other physiological diseases in relation to the fields mentioned prior are also caused by psychological disorder because of the lifestyle choices and moral actions that are carried out by individuals and philosophies in their philosophical ideals they choose to follow in their livelihoods because of psychological trauma and disorder from such trauma. It causes them to go into unhealthy, destructive lifestyles which destroy their physical health. What could be the quickest example I could give? Well, let's say you have been diagnosed with extensive artery buildup, plaque buildup for, let's say, because fatty cells have built up within your cardiovascular system in certain valves of the heart. Not valves, in the arteries extending out of the main structure of the heart. We could pick, let's say, trying to remember my cardiology research here. The name of I believe it's congestive heart disease. It might be classified as well. Regardless of the name, the buildup of fatty plaque cells within the cardiovascular system in the arteries, and it's causing such an extensive blockage for this person that they will need stents put in as a surgical procedure at that time, in order to open up the passages, open up the arteries, expand them for blood flow to actually make its way through the constricted area. Now, you might think, well, how is this at all related to psychology? It's cardiology. Yeah, the patient needs immediate surgery to clear up a blockage in the arteries. How does this relate? Well, if you bother to ask, why does the patient have plaque buildup in the heart? Well, if you go over the patient's history, they're quite obese, they're very much overweight, they have a very, very poor diet, they eat a lot of heavily processed manufactured foods that have a whole bunch of artificial corporate mass-produced food solutions in them, horrible methods of preservation that cause reaction for fatty cell buildup, or just highly saturated fatty foods that they don't consume, ones that are more authentically made, they don't consume in moderation. They don't proportion their daily diets between a variety of foods. It's all just consisting of mainly highly saturated fatty foods, or greasy foods, very oily foods, things of the sort. And, well, you might think, well, that's the answer. Their diet is terrible. Well, no, go further. Why is their diet terrible? Well, the patient suffers very clearly, and let's say that they're not diagnosed with this, but this patient clearly does suffer from depression, a severe major depressive disorder, as well as say, egotistical personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and they also, they also are clearly addicted to various high-fat foods. They eat a whole consistent amount of them, and it very clearly gives emotional gratification to an extent of absolvement of trauma. And where did that all come from? Well, because in their childhood, they were heavily emotionally abused by their parental figures. And in the schooling system, they were constantly ridiculed by peers and teachers as well for not being a well-performing student to the curriculum, and were held back a year as well, and didn't have very strong, in school or just in general, social relations at all. And this continued for years and years and years, to a point where they then philosophically developed more of a misanthropic outlook on humanity and more pessimistic ideals of lack of genuine beneficial change to the functions of their societal surroundings and interpersonal surroundings. And because of this, addiction to these fatty foods, highly poorly produced foods, as comfort, emotional soothers, took place to try and absolve the trauma, both in this regard, to some degree consciously, but as well subconsciously. And this then led to, once they were more free from constrictive interpersonal livelihood affairs, this further developed into more narcissistic personality traits coming about, feelings as if they were infallible, they were perfect, that there really is nothing wrong with them. It was the fault of everyone in their life prior, now, interpersonally, for why they behave this way. And they also now more egotistically act for self-gratification solely. They gain work opportunities that are maybe providing them about a livelihood of standardized middle class in the country that they live in. I'm not going to pick a specific one here. And they feel justified in doing so, and they have less compassion. They can have compassion for, though, at points, other coworkers of theirs, but ultimately they act in more of a hedonistic lifestyle to gratify this trauma, this prior trauma. And because of, going back to the addiction of the high saturated foods, Well, now this over years of time has culminated in lack of general exercise to combat possible and disease of the heart and keeping cardiologic function stable. Well, this has now resulted in the extensive buildup of fatty plaque cells within their arteries to a point of needing to do either a stent operation or so bad to need to do a bypass operation of the artery. So there's an example of that. And that's just one I'm going to give, but you can apply this to every other realm of physiological health out there. All of it: neurology, cardiology, gastroenterology, nephrology, urology, uh, otorhinolaryngology, I believe I pronounced that right, and all of it, all of it you can apply to, and especially in relation to the immune system attacking body's healthy cells, oncology. We know that cancer, so many different types of cancers, very clearly have resulted from immunodysfunction, and in that regard, there is heavy evidence of psychological disorder present in patients presenting with such. And on top of that, in relation as well to sociology, so much of cancer is caused as well clearly by the destructive societal issues that pervade all around us in various nations, communities across the world. It's too extensive to go into now. I point to everything else I've talked about on my channel. Just to give a few short examples, piss poor water production in terms of filtration for lower income communities, terrible, highly processed corporate manufactured foods, mass carbon emission, gas guzzling smokestacks, or just extensive exhaust production from over manufacturing and over usage of vehicles in an environment, and waste dumping into various parts of river systems, lakes, the ocean. And on top of that, the psychological trauma from destructive ideologies that pervade societally, etc. So, that's very clear. Now, in another realm to that, in relation to this disconnect between psychology and all other facets of life, just ontology as a whole, this especially infuriates me, because this is not just a problem with the right-wing portion of the political spectrum. This is a problem on the left-wing side of the political spectrum, my side, and especially amongst those of far leftist belief. There is this notion that in relation to far leftist discourse, that psychology needs to be readily studied, there needs to be more resources for psychoanalysis and actual education towards psychology for the entirety of societies around the world, for the entirety of humanity. And there needs to be more resources for those who have emotional disorders. Sounds great, right? That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I agree. That portion of it is fantastic. Here's the problem, though. The cognitive dissonance I see here, that I've observed so often socially, in not just the external environment around me, online social media, but as well as in my own interpersonal circle. I've heard this amongst friends of mine as well. It's ridiculous nonsense. People on the far left, part of far left ideology, will defend that point, but then counteractively, once someone, as far as I'm concerned, someone with actual competence and knowledge of how psychology functions and how it affects every other field, every other facet of life, will then, when somebody brings up how this problem, especially let's just go with a sociological problem that's prevailing, how psychology is the root source of the problem in relation to psychological trauma from sociological trauma, how this is a part of, and a major part of, why this issue is occurring, they will say, okay, no, it's not. Okay, not everything is psychology. Stop conflating the two. No, it's not all psychological. It doesn't have anything to do with this. This is a separate issue. The emotional side of it has nothing to do with it. Load of complete nonsense. In relation to psychosociology, as far as I'm concerned, as I've talked about with my theoretical proposals, the only reason that right-wing ideologies prevail, why they form in the first place, same goes for much of centrist ideology. And as far as I'm concerned, as of my preconceived biases, far leftist ideology, and in regards as well to all the rest of, in my redesign of the political spectrum, the political phi/political fair, the rest of the left wing, for the most part, falling leftist, center leftist, and moderate leftist, even it also affects clearly those of my category of where I, from my own observations of things in my own current ideologies, where I fall, rising leftist also pervades in that category too. But in relation to the ideals of, say, from leftist perspective, an oppressor on the rightist side of the spectrum, the only reason that those ideals prevail is because of the psychological trauma that has been interpersonally instilled into individual people because of the problematic past collective right-wing ideologies that sociologically, societally surrounded them and affected their interpersonal life, and how it was repeatedly instilled in them over years and years and years. And same goes for the individual people who contributed to the collective problematic societal functioning that affected them in their interpersonal lives because of past right-wing influence, so on, so forth, going back throughout history. That's how it spreads. The only reason that, as far as I'm concerned, let's go with more specifics again, that the only reason that someone has become, let's say, a patriarchal, ultra-capitalist, extremist, fanatical Christian is because of the mass influence of co-opted Christianity, completely destroyed from what the initial beliefs of the Judeo-Christians were. Co-opting of religion that has spread tenfold throughout the world, the mass spread of capitalist fascism throughout, as becoming the sole dominant force of the global economy through centuries, because of Western European problematic cultural ideals that formed out of feudalism. And in relation to toxic masculinity, patriarchy, because of the prevalence of cis male supremacy within vast amounts of not just European societies, but sadly an amount of African societies, South American societies previously, and as well as Eastern Asian societies too, to an extent. Not, and even in relation to European societies and the rest, not in extensive amount maliciously in terms of male dominance attitude, but detrimental nonetheless. And as far as I'm concerned, morally abhorrent. That is the only reason why. In relation to those, though, who function with it, who don't have presence of, okay, well, maybe I was a little too overconfident there. It might be a bit contradicting. Okay, well, let me tweak my words a bit. That's the major reason why. The other reasons could be, as I outlined this in a proposal of mine for philosophy in relation to epistemology. That's one. That's the most major one. The other reason could be because of, even with no present psychological disorder, no present trauma in mass extent, to a point of inducing a mental disorder, personality disorder, or behavioral disorder, that they've been indoctrinated into these beliefs because, well, hey, that's just what everyone else is doing. That's just what people do in society. It's what people do in my social surroundings, so it must be right, right? Or, in the third regard, this is the least possible, I think, but it's worthy to mention, and why I do think there is, technically you could consider there being such a thing as rightist intellectuals. Now, let me clarify, I don't believe that any amount of right-wing ideology is intelligent. It's incredibly unintelligent. Same goes for centrist ideals. But in regards to this, why I would consider them intellectuals is because the other lesser possibility, and again, just to state, I don't mean any of this to degrade or dismiss the experiences of people who have gone through this at all, as I'll get to in a second. The other possibility would be that they've used and tried inducing critical analytical thought, and observation of their societal surroundings, and have thought for themselves, and come to their own conclusions without the just total consciously conformist ideals of the surrounding environment, without mass amount of independent thought. But they've just, in that regard, they've come to very piss poor, terrible conclusions. So that's the other possibility. But in this regard, as far as I'm concerned, the only reason that the only major reason that right-wing ideals prevail is because of the societal trauma of past right-wing ideals. And the far left will argue that, well, fuck that, that doesn't matter. Who gives a shit about them? This unempathic, unsympathetic projection of personality and belief towards the oppressor. There will be many who are of the ideal of what would be called in leftist discourse in relation specifically to classism. This affects, obviously, all realms in relation to race and ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and spirituality, etc. Things of the sort. It affects all realms. But I'm picking from this specific term because I think many of you will know this term. The term of, or the belief of, eat the rich. The far leftist ideal of, well, the peasants are starving, so fuck it, consume the rich. If they're willing to siphon, if they're creating the systems that are entirely reliant on siphoning away the needed resources for the lower classes to survive, to fulfill their own problematic gratification and supremacist ideals, then murder them, eat them, overthrow them in violent revolution, and just destroy them at all ends. There are many who will advocate for killing them. Well, you're a morally abhorrent person as far as I'm concerned, because that just proves to me, in relation to psychology, you're no different than the morally disrupted sociopaths who run this world. You're not. You clearly have psychopathic personality characteristics, if that's your ideal. And now going to the last bit I'll talk about here with psychology. There will be those who claim, this is all across the spectrum, but again, I especially hear it amongst leftist discourse, sadly, is that when, and I've had this happen to me quite a few times when I've tried dealing with issues in my interpersonal life in relation to trying to get someone to realize their very apparent personality disorders. There's this mentality of don't criticize my personality, don't criticize who I am as a person, don't criticize my persona and my personification, not really often in those exact words, but don't criticize me as a character. I am who I am, and I like who I am. Don't judge my personality. That's sacred to me. One, narcissist. Two, I'm gonna say this right now, and I'm gonna make this as clear as I possibly can. There is such a thing as an unhealthy personality and persona. It seems culturally because of mass political movements in the past, and again, sociological trauma influencing the socio-cultural environment, people have really taken on this because of the oppression. Well, it's not even it seems, this is why. All realms, again, because of oppression, classist oppression, racist oppression, sexuality stigma and oppression, gender oppression, religious degradation, and cultural practice degradation, both in whether it's beneficial cultural tradition or problematic cultural tradition, regardless, because of the oppression, and this is directly because of my theory of the unempathic/unsympathetic cycle of conflict. Because of the oppression, the oppressed takes on this, often this mass narcissistic, complete perfectionist view of their egos, their sense of self, and everything attributed to their personal identity. I'm speaking on this regard, I'm speaking on an individual level, not a collective. Though you can obviously, I'm not going to do it right now, maybe later in the video. You can attribute this to, as I've said, larger collectives. But because of this, the oppression has caused someone to take on this ideal that who they are now in relation to what they define as personality, which I'll clarify the definition of personality in a minute, is perfect. It's infallible. They're marked with overconfidence, overcertainty, mass self-vanity of physical image, things of the sort. Well, this is very clearly, as far as I'm concerned, because of the deflection of criticism here. This is almost antisocial. And in relation to my theory of the 5 inherent human desires, because of disrupt to most often in relation to an apathetic response, though it can occur because of overfixation on motivation. Let's just go with apathy for now. Because of the oppressive ideals, you now have someone who does not care to engage in collective interaction with other human beings and their perspectives of how their actions affect them. And that includes how your entire personality affects your social environments, including them. It's dismissal. Now let me define what personality is. It's somewhat, there's still this kind of a debate somewhat amongst the psychiatric field in relation to personality and persona psychology, what specifically personality is. But from what I've observed and the other researchers I've looked at, how I categorize personality and how, in relation to the collective agreeance of it in regards to research that I'm talking about, personality is defined as almost a bridgeway between mentality and thoughts and that of social behaviors that are engaged in. Basically, it's a projection of cognitive thought patterns and behavioral tendencies and patterns in that of your social environment. One in what is embodied just in when you're by yourself in relation to a specific personality, and in relation to personification, persona, is mainly outlined by, further developed, most in relation to Dr. Carl Gustav Jung's outlining for personification, and again in relation to Carl Jung's personality archetypes, what is projected socially in terms of cognitive mentality and behavioral traits amongst other people in your environment. So that's what personality is. Just because it has become sacred to you doesn't mean that that's correct. I'm sorry to tell you. That affects other people. And in that regard, there is such a thing, because people really do not believe it, it seems, as personality disorders. Abnormal personalities. Narcissistic personality disorder. Egocentrism. Sociopathy/psychopathy. General antisocial personality disorder, and there's a spectrum to antisocial personality as well. Schizoid personality disorder. Schizotypical personality disorder. Dependent personality disorder. Independent personality disorder. Histrionic personality disorder, which as far as I'm concerned is, as of right now, as I explained in my implementations for neuroscience, is the most common type of personality disorder in the world as of right now. I still believe that 1 in 9 people suffer from it. As well as borderline personality disorder, extensively common as well. And A-type personality disorder. That's the main amount of and Machiavellian personality disorder. So this is where, and they obviously all bleed into each other in relation to mental disorders, personality disorders, and behavioral disorders. But that's just the general list of the main ones. So that's one myth. And the light's gotten, well, not great where I'm sitting now, so I'm going to try and find another spot with better lighting in the local area to continue this video. Okay, forgive me, I seem to have, between the last clip and this clip, turned into a late 1990s, early 2000s pre-emo cultural individual. But anyway, nothing wrong at all with that cultural attire or inherent cultural practice. Not at all. But just I guess a bit of a, well, slight contrast, I guess, too. Whatever. The joke's ruined by your own hand cam. So, found a spot with better lighting, but silly me. I was initially in Old Town Le Vis, in the Desjardins district of the city for the last portion of the video, and I ended up walking all the way, first time, into the western half of the Lausanne district, and I was able to find a park with well-equipped streetlights. And then right as I got here, I realized, oh yeah, my current campsite, which is right by where all the last bit of footage was taken, had just as adequate lighting, in fact, even better lighting than this. So, anyway. I may go back there. Oh, I'm going to have to go back there anyway, but I might film maybe the last portion of this video in my tent, depending on, well, the time. But anyway, so, what is another widespread myth to debunk? Well, let's go with this one. The ecopolitical ideology system of capitalism, how it has spread extensively across the world in the modern day, and is a branch of the fascist economic system, is not practical at all. It is not acting in capitalistic function with the set economic system in order to obtain some amount of beneficial livelihood, or, well, in this regard, financial security, is not pragmatic thinking. It is idealistic thinking, and as far as I'm concerned, it's most often delusional. So, there is this notion that capitalism, there's two notions that are spread by the rightist side of the political spectrum. One from far right to rising right, far rightist to rising rightist, and the other more of a falling rightist to center rightist mentality, even as well just in most realms of centrism. And also, you can regard some amount of it as well going into the beliefs of a center leftist. As for moderate rightist, from what I've seen, or what I guess could be categorized as moderate right, I'm a bit iffy on that, beliefs towards it, but in that regard, specifically to the right wing, there are two main ideas that are perpetuated. On the further, on the higher end, I guess, going with the political phi, how I've designed it, the higher end of the right wing, you have the idea that capitalism is the only sustainable way for human societies, in terms of set economies, how they can function, that which is built upon the belief, the incorrect belief, that human beings, because of our inherent selfishness, strive better in economic competition for resources with each other to obtain psychologically gratifying individuality. Not true. So there's that belief that's perpetuated by the far right. And then on the lower end of the right-wing half of the political phi, / political fe, there's the idea that the capitalist system is not fantastic, but it's the only one that somewhat functions well because of the lies that have been perpetuated throughout the westernized world of not true communism and socialism, and lies perpetuated about the ideals of Marxism and just entire majority of upper leftist ideology. But so capitalism sucks, but it's the best we have, or that's going into more, I guess, a lower political gray area, that capitalism is terrible, and I am for more amounts of leftist ideals to some degree, but the only actual practical way to even survive in whatever variants of how a nation has set up its capitalist economic system in the modern world, because as far as I'm concerned, every nation on this planet is either capitalist, or it's basically just a capitalist shell puppet state that's maybe I guess, half government controlled social funding machine, somewhat. Not much different, but that it's the only that functioning to some degree with the system at hand to in more of this anarcho-minimalist mentality is the only actual way to practically live. Both of these notions are wrong, as far as I'm concerned. So let's first tackle far-right ideal. Okay. The idea that capitalism, the idea that privatized economy for sole executive policy enforcement and control of the private sector, of a singular person or small group of people in high private company corporate command for the redistribution of either an established national or international trade currency for negotiation of resources, or just some sort of set determining process controlled in complete execution by the bourgeoisie and the entirety of corporate elites, that free market is the only way for sustainable human progress, scientific in terms of technology and science, and just societal safety for communities and human development psychologically, is a destructive lie. And it's not only is it not true, we have proof of this, but it is actually completely contradicting to both what, in relation to objectivism, Ayn Rand herself outlined, and what Adam Smith outlined in terms of so-called progressive individuality. As far as I'm concerned, when you have privatized corporate control for land resources, food resources, water resources for the most part, heating for building units that you reside in, that someone resides in, or electricity, electrical flow of private land, cooling systems, things of the sort, or in terms of other products produced in every form of industry, constant taxations going and profit flowing from one company to the next. This hinders individuality. It doesn't aid it. Because let's talk about something that is not only inevitable to capitalism, it's inevitable to happen, but is also rooted in the ideological principles of capitalism and how it operates in a social, how the ideology functions in a social environment. That being expansionism is the main one, the idea of expansionism. And on top of that as well, gentrification. So, in expansionism, well, firstly, what is it? It is when a company goes through the process of duplicating branches, expanding its actual corporate control with further locations opened up for its operations, or further involvement or paradeals with other organizations and corporations for profit gaining and executive, as well as an amount of executive control over the function of production of another resource, maybe in relation to what the company was initially providing or not. Just a corporate entity expanding its control, basically. And in regards to that, you might be thinking, well, how is one able to do that? I'm sure many of you already know the answer to that. And sorry if my wording is a bit off. It's getting colder in the night, and some dysphagia is acting up. But anyway. When a system such as capitalism is initially set up, most likely an amount of expansionism in its early years, early stage capitalism, it's not going to be that big of a problem in terms of the affordability of gaining needed survival resources. It's, as far as I'm concerned, still unethical, still highly unethical. I'll get to that in a second. But living-wise, it's not as harsh as compared to if the system is still in place decades later, late-stage capitalism, which is what the world is in right now. There's a reason that the mid to late 1800s going into the early 1900s, though there was mass struggle for renting spaces, paying off land debts, for the proletariat in various nations across the world that had a capitalist going into, or a pre-capitalist set economic system. We're getting into it. There's a reason, though, that in terms of just, say, food necessities, or say in more of the agricultural sector, farming equipment, or being able to move to another area, say, of land, after, even with the debts, or even with still paying off the debts of the initial land you were living on, the private land. There's a reason that they could still move maybe to another area and pay it well enough whilst paying off the debts, being able to do both, which there are accounts of this common enough, looking back through history, of in various nations, especially in the Western world, of this happening, where it was livable. So what happened? Why is there so much financial disparity now? Why is there so much depravity, not just in the unethical nature, supremacy that capitalism dictates in its principles, but why the rates of homelessness are rising because of financial strife, and poverty is going up, despite what also the far right will claim. Well, when companies from way back when started to expansionize, because they saw it as a way to obtain further profit in abiding by a free market system, and the goal of trying to create an economic empire, basically a goddamn kingdom for themselves, the idea of competitive profit and it being allowed for and condoned morally within Smith's outlining of capitalism. When this started to occur with various companies, McDonald's, Walmart, Target, Burger King, Subway, I'm naming more North American countries here, or if we want to look at some amount of, well, we can look in the modern sense now of, say, in Philippines, Jollibee, or what's the one in Japan? There's a certain convenience store corporation in Japan that's massively expansionist throughout the country. They might even have certain locations, I think, in China, but anyway. As well as Walgreens, or No Frills, or Bulk Barn, or Home Depot, Canadian Tire. The list goes on and on and on of mega corporate monopolies that have now grown. Well, all these companies, if you look back at their histories, maybe started with a few locations, founded maybe in around the mid 1930s roughly to early 1950s, around there, roughly around there. most, like, from what I'm recalling of the history for each of those companies that I researched, roughly. Or at least, even if their brand name isn't the same as it was then as it is now, the corporations nonetheless, or individuals involved executively in high positions of these companies further developing the actual brand. They started to expansionize because they had initially, in relation to mass profit gain, because of tailoring to consumerism, again, promoted within capitalism, and materialism too, they gained enough profit to be able to afford, based on mega real estate agencies and companies that had mass rights over, and again, growing expansion over buying up land, territory, and so forth throughout the world. Well, they gained enough wealth to be able to do pair deals with real estate companies, buy up land, pair deals with development agencies, develop further locations, be able to charge cheaper amounts now because they had more customer flow to these branches, and because of that further wealth gain, more ability to afford expanding, putting another location here, another factory there, another now we have enough to make our own transport line. We have transport trucks, ship lines. Great, we'll develop. Hell, now we have, because we're being able to transport our own products, because now we have more easy accessibility because it's now controlled solely by us. Well, now we have more money to expand our branches for more customers, lower prices now. We don't have to charge as much for our items. So, great, now we can have we have enough to create our own private corporate development companies to develop any further facilities we need. So, and I think you see what I'm getting at here. Now, because of that expansion and mass profit flow towards the corporate heads and their system of regulation, side note as well, capitalism is not deregulation of economics, despite what is claimed in free market. So, over decades and decades and decades of this going forth, now we're at a point in history where there's so much private economic control because of this expansionism, so many monopolies, again, not just the ones I listed, there's plenty more, ones that are massive internationally, and others that are monopolies solely domestically, nationally, within their individual countries, because, as well, in relation to neocolonialism, of foreign influence from America, Canada, England, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Australia, and Germany as well, Russia, now, once Russia became a capitalist oligarchy, things of the sort. But, so, bottom line in that regard for expansionism, because of, also in relation to capitalism, the determination of value, economic value of a product or a resource, because of how much there is of it, how much supply there is, the demand of it, how much the consumers demand for it, what is needed in a populace or demanded of the producer for consumption, and how, in that regard as well, how available it is, to easily available or extensively difficult it is to make available to the general public or just any amount of private buyers, whether they're part of the average populace or the elitists. So, because of those as well, on value placed for them on the stock market, and the determination of value to those resources, because of the expansionism, these companies now have the ability to buy up more of them. Whether or not they're rarer or more available, they have the ability, because of their mass extensive gain of profit funneling straight to the corporate heads, not to the entirety of their workforce, the labor force. They're able to obtain further resources for expansion, not just in terms of the financial trade currency, the actual physical material. So, because of that, we're now at a point where we're at a point where so much of what everyone, but especially the general populace, those who don't make up the top 1% of society, it's at a point where these corporations control so much, have para-deals with so many other smaller, moderate expansionist corporations, and the small businesses as well, that are barely expansionist, barely make any livable amount that they can keep, because there is now mass provisional control of basically every realm of life. So, in that, so there's that portion of it. Now, in terms of as well, not just the inevitability of that happening, and the inevitability of monopolies forming under capitalism, as far as I'm concerned, ethically, capitalism is also inherently monopolistic. I talked about this in one of my sociology implementations, that capitalism inherently, in what is outlined by Adam Smith and others who are patrons of the ideology, Ayn Rand, you could point as well at, trying not to go with, well, John Mills as well, in relation to outlining of classical liberalism, and well, absolutely Dr. Jordan Peterson, a fraud of a psychologist, so him too. And well, okay, those are top individuals who come to mind, but it inherently, from what is outlined, superioritizes the private employer, an employer of a workforce or an employee for any given company. Well, it superioritizes them in terms of needed what is deemed a person who is valuable to obtain needed resources that negotiation is determined by via financial currency or whatever device is used for trade negotiation, over the employee who is under their policy control, who in the private sector, even if the employer is negotiable and allows them to be a part of the decision-making process, following in more of a pseudo-socialist or pseudo-Marxist socialist moral value, or, well, I guess in some form as well, an egalitarian idea. Well, even that, under the economic system of what needs to be officiated in a legal system, in a set legal system alongside it, if there is one that's not, say, an anarcho-capitalist system or libertarian capitalist system, which, despite claims of certain more liberating ideologies, is still economic authoritarianism. But even so, because of the complete private control of an employer at any higher level, and this being allowed within a societal system, this is essentially superioritizing said employer and inferioritizing the labor worker, the employee. So anyway, in relation to pragmatism, what is just seen as societal pragmatism, the idea that because of human beings' internal emotional selfishness, which I will agree with, that human beings are internally selfish, we'll agree with that. Because of that, therefore, it is only logical to operate in external selfishness to a fullest extent. To have beneficial communal livelihoods. Well, doesn't make sense. In this regard, contradicting as it is, sadly, we see how external individualism destroys the lives of those underneath private policy control. Because under the notion of capitalism, all natural resources, this includes manufactured resources, this includes housing, maintenance of housing, food, water as well, depending on what country you live in, even healthcare, private healthcare, or any other pharmaceuticals, even if you're in a universal healthcare country, pharmaceuticals that could slightly benefit, have some amount of benefit to using them. Things of the sort. All of that, under the ideology's dictation, allows for demanded taxation by the users of such resources under private control. And when you have that constant siphoning of finance from every angle of resource usage at every level of communal involvement from a private owner, all these constant tax deductibles, not talking about governmentally here, I'm talking economically. When you have that from every single possible angle, you will be at a point where you cannot further your economic growth. You cannot gain more money unless you were to obtain a higher position of pay at any massively widespread corporation, or just any corporation that had the ability, if they could afford it, because again of this constant siphoning that doesn't just affect you, it affects someone else in your society. Because of this elitist siphoning of the lower classes for profit, you will be at a point where you cannot grow your wealth. You can't afford. You have a limited amount of affordability to resources. And unless you were to abide by or gain a position at a job that could provide higher income to keep up with the constant billing of using resources, you're going to stay stagnant. It's inevitable. And in regards to, so because of that, as far as I'm concerned, when you aren't able to obtain basic physical resources for living, and in that regard affecting the metaphysical resources, emotional, disrupting emotional connectivity between human beings, now because of desperation for the physical ability to live, survive, this deprives the emotional ability to survive, the psychological ability, which is not beneficial to human selfishness. This destroys our individual wants. And as far as I'm concerned, paradoxically, but a naturally occurring double standard. A beneficial way to achieve individuality would be through collectivism, actual communal collectivism. And as far as I'm concerned, being an anarcho-communist, an attempt at equalization of resource distribution to prevent hierarchy of resources. I'm also for the abolishment of all money. So now, well, hey, I guess I just technically debunked both of those right-wing stances at the same time. I was trying to aim it more for far right, but so I guess that was more so the explanation for why capitalism is not beneficial for human selfishness and individuality, debunking, and also why it's also a branch of fascism, of a fascistic economic ideology. As well, I'm not going to go into the outline of fascism here, but I have before, especially on, well, my posted theories now online on Quora at the moment. But anyway, I'll also address the other bit of idiocy from the right wing, that being, or those who are of falling leftist ideals or centrist ideals, that it's just I believe that, well, Cam, everything that you just said, but it's more practical to operate with the system, sadly, to an extensive degree. No, it's not, because all that does is perpetuate the system, as you are giving your labor back to these corporate monopolies, corporate lobbyists who control the world governmental systems, who are the governmental systems. They themselves are the governmental elites as well, but I guess more on that in a different bit. And not only are you perpetuating the system further, it morally condones it. In relation to my theory and philosophy, specifically ethics and ontology, of intrinsic moral practicality, morality on a human conceptual level is practical. It is pragmatic. It is not idealistic. In terms of what's beneficial morals, and even detrimental morals, how human beings, based on individually formed moral stances, how one views morality is to them practical. What is socially condonable for human beings to do. That's the definition of morality. Sorry, the footage just cut. No postmodernists, you did not change the definition of morality. Even if it's in a different language of what to define what is categorized as morality, the definition still rings the same. The idea of morality, you didn't change the idea of morality, but that's another thing I'll get into in a bit. It's not a practical means, because even though you might be able to obtain some amount of needed resources, you are still morally condoning what the system has set out to do. You still are involved in the perpetuation. The working class, directing this at the proletariat, not the elites this time. You are directly responsible, not indirectly. You are directly responsible for participating and contributing to a corporate entity's private policy function, extraction of wealth from a consumerist and materialist populace, and your own demise, the siphoning of pay from you. No matter how much you criticize the corporate overlords, you're still a part of their game. And don't worry, I'm not excluding me from this. I'll get into this more in a bit in relation to the paradox of existence. I'm not excluding myself from this problem. I'm sadly just as much a hypocrite as all of you. We are all hypocrites to a major extent, until we all try and mitigate that hypocrisy to a major extent. You perpetuate it. This is okay in relation to not just economies, oppressive governmental systems, oppressive religious organizations, cultural beliefs, or just in general problematic cultural practices, patriarchy, matriarchy, white supremacy, other ethnic supremacy, black supremacy, Hispanic supremacy, Han supremacy, so on and so forth. Homophobia, panphobia, biphobia, transphobia, agenderphobia, general LGBTQ plus prejudice, sexuality, and romantic type stigma. And oppression, prejudice, and bigotry as a whole. Oh, and ableism in there. Ableist prejudice as well. In terms of societally, what is set up, the oppressors create the problem, they create it, they disperse it out into the world, and then the oppressed, those who are subject to this, the subjugated, we perpetuate it. They make it, we continue it. That is the sad reality that so much of, especially far leftist discourse in regards to the oppressed, don't want to accept in regards to creating the problems that far rightists don't want to accept. But that's sadly, as far as I'm concerned, what it is. And okay, I think I've said enough for this myth. So, in regards to that, morality is inherently practical. It's what, by a person or a collective group of people, is considered to be socially acceptable and condonable to engage with and put onto another human being, or how to engage with another human life or animal life, or other animal life, because human beings are an animal as well. And capitalism, in that regard, fascism, in that regard, is impractical. It's morally abhorrent. Okay? There's that. I'm going to go back to the area I was in and to my campsite, and then film the rest of this video. Yep, next day. Got too late, got too cold. I didn't sleep very well last night. I wasn't very properly positioned in my tent. Stayed warm enough for the most part, so I was wondering what exactly was keeping me up most of the night. Maybe it was a combination of improper positioning and the drop in temperature, but, well, it wasn't the greatest, but it wasn't the worst. It was a rather foggy morning. It seems not just here in it is, but well, for the entirety of the greater Quebec City area. But, well, hopefully you'll be able to tell it's cleared up a bit. More visibility. Sorry also if there's a bit of a glare. Just decided to position myself with my back to the sun, just so I'd be able to, so I just didn't have to squint my eyes really to look at the camera. But can't really tell as of right now. But anyway, so back to talking about stupid myths, stupid social myths. I'm trying to come up with next one to talk about, and this one's been the last few hours on my mind the most, so I guess I'll just go ahead with this. So this next one relates to the first one in relation to psychology and the whole of, well, healthcare, really. But instead of from the perspective, from the ignorant perception of the general populace of the world, this one is now from the side of the actual healthcare world and scientific research community. A massive problem that is highly destructive, and that is of psychiatric and medical dismissal and ignorance towards how cultural backgrounds, cultural practices, and how specific demographics within the world function overall. The ignorance of that to diagnosis and prognosis for potential, in relation to societal trauma, a potential psychiatric disorders, and in that regard, to physiological medical disorders. And then, on the other end of that, ignorance to, or considering non-problematic cultural traditions, practices of a people group, for specific individuals within said groups, considering them to be a health issue or an abnormality when they aren't, and provably so aren't. So, yeah, I guess that general myth. So, here's the thing. Sad reality is, though there are a number of fantastic researchers and doctors and surgeons out there who do not abide by the oppressive regulatory healthcare systems of the world that are either oppressive or, as far as I'm concerned, are impractical in terms of attempted regulation over the handling and functioning of the system, which is pointless and inevitably has and does continuously lead to mass problems, as it's not individualistic. Despite the genuinely competent members of the healthcare community and scientific community out there, scientific research, there are a whole slew more of regulatory professionals who abide by exactly what they have been taught, trained, traumatized, and indoctrinated into believing is a proper way of practically going about medical and psychiatric care. And in that, so often, these professionals will, just like the general populace, also be under the belief of the cognitive mindset that their field is here, pick whichever one, and then another field is here. Once again, pick whichever one. That there is no connectivity between them. That intersectionality just is non-existent. But in reality, as I explained before, that couldn't be further from the truth. And this so often causes mass strife for proper diagnosis and prognosis of patients. Because let's first look at a majority of universal healthcare nations in the world. There's this praise that, oh well, complete free regulatory healthcare. It's perfect, it's fantastic. You don't have to pay for any of your, visits, any amount of equipment needed for treatment. You don't need to pay for it. Well, in regards to, for certain countries, yes, for the most part. However, in terms of others, including Canada, for this, in terms of healthcare, that only applies if you're within a specific territory, or region, province, state, a specific administrative district of your country, one where you take up residence or are officially taking up residence. And outside of that area, you would, if you were to actually get into any sort of issue with health providing, needing of medical treatment, you would need to actually cover the cost, as I've had to do. On top of that, now, in that regard, overall, more universal healthcare countries don't participate in that practice. There are certain ones that do, but what is common amongst most of them, it seems, from my research, is that of everything that is conducted within the regulatory healthcare system is free, technically, other than everything paid back through taxation, except for any additional, potentially beneficial in a minimalist amount of treatments that are provided not by the regulatory healthcare system, by private entities, or any potential medications in a minimal dose that could be beneficial for, along with needed lifestyle changes, a bit of just an aid. Again, and any competency would be recommended in a minimal dosage as a potential help towards recovery, or more of a remission stage of a illness. That is very problematic for all the reasons that I, listed in the last portion, as far as I'm concerned. But in this, in regards to how so much of the world, and this includes private healthcare nations as well, in regards to prioritization of a patient's needs, there's this notion that's so severely common of first come, first serve. Even if another patient is in more dire critical need of attention than another patient. Speaking from first-hand experience, here in Canada, that's rampant, nationwide, especially in the pitiful excuse of ER, emergency room, urgent care that we have here in the provincially and territorially regulated hospitals. Hours upon hours upon hours of waiting. And you might be thinking, well, this could be because doctors are busy. They don't have the time to immediately see every patient. Well, in some cases, yes. But how it is for a majority of the time is more so a lack of resources for doctors to actually work with. Lack of genuinely needed equipment, lack of diverging from the regulated, enforced policies, governmentally, of the systematic force, or again, in private healthcare, economically, in terms of private policy control with certain, again, depending on the nation, certain interference via governments. But lack of being able to diverge from the system for the needed care of specific patients, and working with the patients for what is needed for them. And in this, even with complaints from doctors within the systems themselves, there are so many who, of those same complaints, still comply with the oppressive, authoritarian regulations that do not aid patients. And on top of that, now going more towards the prejudice viewpoints. In relation to demographic ignorance, racism, classism, LGBTQ+ bigotry, ableism, especially ableism, sexism, and spiritual degradation, religious prejudice, to a provably problematic extent, is widespread globally throughout the medical world and psychiatric world. From mischaracterizing in white supremacist power structure of Black vernaculars and Hispanic vernaculars, and more East Asian to Southeast Asian or Central South Asian vernaculars and accents as dysarthria, slurred speech, or dysphagia, or disrupt to articulation when it's not, to declaring in sexology that more homoerotic and bioerotic and panerotic, scolioerotic, etc., or masochistic, non-encroaching, sadistic, BDSM, dominatrix, etc., practices are inherently more dangerous or destructive ethically and socially, or that they're more unsanitary, especially with in relation to more eroticism of homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, etc. I mentioned just before that, to the very much patriarchal viewpoints and understanding of the body structure of certain functions, especially within endocrinology, genealogy, for geneticists more specifically as well, and gynecology, and as well as in regards to also cardiology. The misunderstanding of more cis-feminine, or those who have more, in terms of physiological gender, have more associated feminine characteristics, down to reproductive organs, and chromosomal structures, and the hormonal and neurochemical systems, in regards to that, and how issues present within the female body. So, and this is just these are just the main ones I'm picking at. There's more in regards to what I mentioned. But this is something that it's sadly the notion, with all of it, it's sadly the notion that because of these systems of regulation, that you come in, say to a hospital or a private clinic, you come in, you see the doctor, they look you over in a quick examination. Most often it's merely physical. There's no assessment of emotional metaphysical process and the patient's psychological health, if there could be a present issue. And then for, say, physical discomfort that the patient is experiencing, and then if the doctor doesn't have maybe a clear understanding of what the cause may be, they'll refer you to another specialist for that specific area of the body, even though it's not just, even if it's predominantly affecting this area, it could be affecting other portions of the physiological body structure of the patient, other organs, and absolutely affecting the psychological state of the patient. They'll refer to another specialist without any attempt even at further assessment. Now, maybe the doctor doesn't know about the mass amount of connections between the other structures of the body. Good, that would be good to then try and find a specialist who did, but most often as well with that, it's just a one-off, see the doctor, then you go to the specialist and go away from the doctor. They don't really have many of the attitude that they don't really have time to come back to the case. And in that as well, then going to a specialist, if that specialist can't figure it out, the process then seems to repeat. This is especially common in the Western world, but there is a fair amount of this as well, as I've looked into, from obviously a vast array of the world that has been sadly westernized through years of brutal colonialism. So, and that's in relation to just physiology. Then if a patient goes to a doctor specifically complaining about psychological problems, or what they feel to be a psychological issue, the doctor will then, unless the doctor is in terms of regulatory licensing qualified to handle psychiatric dilemmas, either they themselves or a specialist that they refer them to will look at the patient's emotional state, again, on a separate basis than the rest of the physiology, which is, as I've said before, ludicrous. Especially with the very clear presence of psychosomatization. for disorders categorized as somatic issues, which is where, for those of you who don't know what psychosomatic illness is when physiological pain, real physiological felt pain is caused by psychological problems. Consciously and or subconsciously. And in regards to my analytic neuroscience work, I think is even further proof that the psychological state is a branch of the nervous system, and also further proof of my neuroscience implementation that psychology needs to bloody well be considered a subspecialty of neurology. Sorry, that's just... hold on. I'm waiting for this little garbage truck to pass. I just made a little leaf bird, or maybe... I guess you could even... given the time of year it is, getting close to Halloween. A little yellow bat. Just pulled off some ends here. Well, that was... yeah, that was underwhelming. Okay. Well, now the truck's going, and I hope I didn't disrupt the focus adjustment of the camera's sensory system, but anyway. So, in this medical ignorance as well, there is, in regard specifically to ableism, very, very prevalent disregard of the capabilities of patients amongst psychiatric and medical professionals. Again, I'm using the term professional lightly, because I don't consider doctors who engage with this sort of moral these enactments, I don't consider them actual competent professionals. But anyway, there's a dismissal of their capabilities. Especially, I see this in the realms of psychological examination, where even in subtle ways, which I think is provably untrue, there's this notion that patients with, specifically often in regards to personality disorders, that a patient will not change as a person. That once the emotional traumatization has occurred and personality disorders are present, then, or even it can go into leading of behavioral disorders, attitudes towards such. Not so much in regards to attitudes towards mental disorders, interestingly enough, overall, but regardless, there's this notion that once someone's personality has problematically developed this way, in a disruptive sense to themselves, because of years of apathy, in relation to disrupt to their 5 subconscious desires, and disrupt to pro-socialization in regards to interactive loneliness, or from cognitive overfixation on motivation. There's this regard that once it's occurred, there's basically no going back, and all you can do in regards to treatment with how individuals interact amongst one another is basically separate individuals whose personalities don't mix very well. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's provably untrue. As we have seen, there is provable evidence in regards to people with personality disorders, those not just of who I've researched, as I have met now someone themselves, and I'll talk about this in a different video. I have met someone who completely self-treated. They're completely self-treated to a beneficial extent their own case of borderline personality disorder. And interestingly enough, they were my hitchhiking ride to the city of St. Hyacinthe, Quebec. But anyway, there is proof that there have been individuals who become so self-aware of the disorders they face that they are able to mitigate to an extent of remission. I'd count it as provable remission of disruptive psychiatric symptoms and disrupt to pro-socialization caused by the psychiatric disorders, personality disorders, overall. And it's not set in stone, even for those that, yes, in extensively how there is morality disrupting emotional disorders. Just because you have that does not mean that you will inherently, one, you're not going to present the same as someone else in terms of said symptoms. They'll be similar, but it's not going to be concretely the same as how another presents. But it does not mean you are going to be a provably morally abhorrent person, or not able or aren't able to become self-aware enough to mitigate problematic behaviors and engagements. We've seen, I can point, what's one example I could point to? I'm just going to give an example of a researcher, a neuroscientist actually, who I didn't mention them in my scientific proposal videos, but I used their research in regards to psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, because they themselves are a sociopath, for some of my theories, specifically in regards to my theories of the narcissist, the egotist, the A-type, and the fear of systematic collapse, and the histrionic, the borderline, the the dependent, the attention seeker, the eccentric, and the fear of dying alone, and the sociopath, the antisocial, the catatonic, the schizoid, and repeated disappointment in humanity. Well, and the manic psychopath, and internalized self-loathing from understanding the harshness of existence. But anyway, and their name is Dr. James Fallon, and you might know them as writing the book The Moth, Confessions of a Pro-Social Sociopath. And they are someone who is very self-aware of the lack of compassion that they emotionally, cognitively have, and how it was brought to their attention, and how they have worked towards mitigating it, and also how it's very apparent that their presentation did not showcase with any large amount of mass manipulation towards people in their surrounding livelihood. So I'll mention their name. Go check them out for further evidence of this. Another name I don't. Well, actually, I don't remember their name, but there's a lawyer who she is not I don't believe she's a traumatized gain sociopath in relation to a certain amount of genetic predispositions caused by societal problems influencing a family bloodline. She was born with congenital sociopathy to some degree, and she was a former lawyer. I believe she's retired from that now, but she wrote the book. I believe it's titled "Sociopath: Hidden in Plain Sight." I believe that's the title of the book, "Sociopath: Hidden in Plain Sight." And she appeared on the YouTube channel dedicated to psychological research, psychoanalysis of the personality disorders of sociopathy/psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, which I highly recommend you go watch. Is called Psychopathy Is, and they do interviews with various people who have experienced relationships, highly toxic relationships with morally corrupt psychopaths, and those who are psychopaths themselves, diagnosed psychopaths, or I believe there's also an amount of self-diagnosed psychopaths, and their experiences with having the disorder. And no, none of them are murderers, just so you're aware, or at least, okay, we'll get to that in a bit. So, it's a very ableist notion that someone can't become, because of critical thought and observations and gain self-awareness because of their own life experiences, that they can't become, it's ableist prejudice that they can't become self-aware of this, of their psychological issues, and mitigate morally destructive behaviors of theirs. I feel it's a complete hypocrisy, manufactured hypocrisy, to the entirety of what healthcare supposedly stands for and scientific research stands for, especially in regards to the Hippocratic Oath. But on top of that, I guess to throw in here as well, also extreme ageism within the healthcare system to mass extent of ageist prejudice, intellectual ageism, where often often the perpetrator of such being doctors within their late 20s to mid 40s, around this generational age range. Often it's two ends, one from prejudice directed towards younger patients, and then prejudice directed towards elderly patients. For younger patients, it's what I see a lot now is there's a lot of dismissal of younger patients' genuine concerns, and I've experienced this firsthand myself, with both with not just psychological issues, but moreover physiological issues. Now, I know what you might be thinking in regards to, for those of you who know genuine psychology, in relation to psychosomatic illness. Yes, most illness to some degree has a psychosomatic presence, and yes, I will state this right now. For those of you who think in connection to the first thing I talked about here, and for those of you who think that you're for some reason above somehow your emotional state, you will not be able to tell the difference between physical damage and psychosomatic disrupt. Alright, you won't. There's this notion that you can tell the difference. No, you can't. It's as real as rain. It's as real as getting your arm stabbed with a knife. And the same goes for hypochondria / illness anxiety disorder. There are those who dismiss that and think, well, oh, it's just fear of germs. It's an irrational fear, so what? Well, that irrational fear is a mental disorder that is highly destructive to the patient's health, of delusional beliefs, of constant unsanitary fear of unsanitary presence, of an unsanitary presence within their body. And no, illness anxiety disorder / hypochondria and psychosomatic illness are not the same either. They're not the same category, and I agree with them not being in the same category. So, but back to, even with the presence of potential psychosomatic illness, so often what happens, I see now, especially with that of performative activism in the governmental forces of the world, there will be, first off, if a young patient comes in with complaining about, let's say, shortness of breath, trouble of breathing, many doctors, specialists and or an ER doctor or an EMT, an immediate just a quick visit to the doctor, or a general practitioner, will first automatically, without proper assessment at all, really not any proper assessment, just do a quick overview and deem it to be possibly just anxiety. Not even psychosomatic illness, just possibly, it seems like it could be anxiety. Oh, are they stressed about school midterms? Are they stressed about are they not really sociable? And in that regard, just surface level trauma, that possible traumatizers that aren't really in depth either. So, and even when the patient insists to try and push a little further, either down receiving psychological treatment, or maybe doing just some amount more physiological testing to be sure of potential issue, because let's say they've been having the shortness of breath recurrently to a point where it feels like they're going to pass out, and not in the sense of, say, hyperventilation, of just general extreme constriction of the air passageways. Well, most often the doctors will say, no, it's pointless, or no, I don't think it's needed. Just go home, rest, just try and relax, just try and realize what's making you anxious. It's very just abrupt. It's just very. It's very dismissive. It's very just off you go mentality. And then on the opposite end of the elderly demographic, most often when an elderly patient will complain of, let's say, in nursing home care or retirement home care, private or in terms of, or even say in elderly palliative care, in end-of-life care, which is it's all morally deplorable, but this is very disturbing. Well, most often when an elderly patient is complaining that they feel severe physical discomfort or are maybe in a state of maybe because of let's say it's an illness affecting, let's specifically say it's a illness affecting, they have an illness affecting their emotional state and cognitive function to some degree. Whether or not it is severely hindering their cognitive thought process or not. Doctors will most often, even if a patient is complaining about a problem in that regard, it's not uncommon for nurses and doctors to just say, really have the mentality of, well, they're older, they don't really know what's best for them, they don't really, they're not really all that there cognitively, they're not very, they're not really capable of understanding what's happening to them at this point. And I'm not speaking, and even with the presence of dementia, of deteriorative atrophy of the brain structure, one, this is still deplorable. Two, I'm not right now speaking in terms of that. And even that, I don't believe anymore that would be, I used to somewhat believe this, but I don't anymore that would be morally condonable. It's not. That is basically all just a way of calling the elderly individual unintelligent and not looking deeper at what could be going on. So, and this is this is all very common. Very, very common. There was one more thing, actually, I think I was going to mention for this, and then get on to the next topic. Let me just think about it for a second. Okay, this is it. So, a bit of a combination again here. So, it is very clear that in terms of, well, one, I already think that, A, regulatory schooling systems are abhorrent and terrible by design, and that regulatory healthcare systems are terrible, again, by design. In that, there is very clearly, in the modern day, mass corporate capitalist lobbying influence over not just the entirety, obviously, of the educational system, as I proposed in my theory of purposely stupefied systemic education for elitist authority, but also especially within the medical schooling system, for how physicians are taught, or in relation to psychiatric work, how doctors are trained to examine patients based on, really, all of it's ironic. It's based on pseudoscience. Everything I just mentioned of how the system operates, it works in pseudoscience. It hinders actual progress. So much of the medical educational system relies on funding from, well, corporate lobbyists, as do all sectors of governmental control in pretty well the modern world, for needed resources for any slight amount, not just for the programs that they run that are problematic, but also any slight amount of beneficial influence that individual scholars or teaching doctors. They have. And as far as I'm concerned, that has led massively to, obviously, the system being in favor of science, pseudoscience, not lies, that have been perpetuated within a privatized economy. Things I mentioned before, for the continuation of the functioning of how modern society operates on a global scale. And in regard to that, for this being sort of a merging of false beliefs, the general populace is under the notion that the only true way for safe practitioner testing or operation is with someone obtaining a license through a regulatory system and then being put out after going through, say, residency, and then being put out into the world to operate with patients. Well, if you couldn't tell by my notions with that, and from my video exploring Gatineau Part 2, I had a very interesting conversation with someone on this matter. Interesting. An infuriating conversation with someone on this matter who was a moron, back all those months ago. Well, to anyone who believes that, you are a fool beyond belief. Residency is a contained and controlled environment, most often, where students spend most often the first few years, especially again in the westernized world, spend the first few years in basically just observation of surgical, say in surgeon training, surgical procedures, or in observation, or just in sitting in on lectures from doctors, those who have the doctorate in the fields that they are trying to go into, with, again, very little, except maybe in the first few courses, of very little intersection discourse. There is now more brief mentioning of intersectionality again. Wow, that leaf landed perfectly. But it's very little. It's very minimal. And on top of that, after said amount of time being just in the classroom, more so, I guess you could call it, though obviously it's post-secondary, more leeway with that, the first-hand experience most often comes in the form of said controlled environments in medical universities, where, though it is there are many, say, operations or observations of real patients with real conditions, with in regards to both psychiatric and physiological conditions and disorders, even though they are genuine patients of and suffering from illnesses and are being treated, the environment's just the same as certain amounts of the regulatory healthcare systems are condensed and controlled in more of, which often ends up, as far as I'm concerned, with that failing. It is a reason that so much, there's been no progress really in, there's not been many major progresses listened to. They haven't been looked at or listened to in research because of these regulated systems of genuine treatments that can help prevent these problems from occurring. And once doctors are thrust out of this system into the, I don't want to call it the real world, but the actual regulatory healthcare systems of the world, or in their own private practice, it's a vast contrast for how it actually presents in coordination with the environments around the patients and the doctors, then compared to the more controlled environment, which is basically just a pseudo half-assed mock simulation of said actual issues and conflicts in the genuine societal environment. It does not prepare you for it. It does a minimalist amount of it as far as I'm concerned. You aren't going to have actual knowledge of it until as far as I'm concerned, genuine research to how the system, if it was to ever actually realize how they are contributing to the problem of why these physical and psychiatric illnesses are occurring, and individual doctors were to do their own research, and combined with that, be involved with patients' interpersonal livelihoods and observe how the societal factors around them, the communal structuring and culture, the socio-cultural, socio-economic, governmental forces, all of it, how it hinders or helps their issues, well, then it's not going to be any amount of genuine, actual, beneficial aid. So, yeah, that was just kind of a combination there. So, okay. I'm going to do the next portion in my tent, because, well, there will be a portion of me that won't be able to be legally displayed out this publicly. Sorry for the cramped space right now in my tent. So, okay. My phone's running out of storage. Oh, goody gumdrops. So, I'm going to try and cram the last few of these together a bit quicker than the previous three. So let's just begin with another myth, that the world is in a post-colonial era in terms of sociology. No, it is not. There is a notion spread, especially amongst those of neoliberal beliefs, that, and just, well, far right-wing belief as well, in general, that in terms of colonialism, the mass expansion of white supremacy from Western European monarchies, elitist, aristocratic monarchies, that committed the mass cultural genocides of various North American indigenous groups, South American indigenous groups in that part, Hispanic groups and Latino groups, Black ethnic groups across the African continent, and in the implementation of mass chattel slavery throughout North and South America, as well as the Caribbean, and then as well back to Western Europe and Central Europe, as well as the degradation of a slew of Eastern Asian cultures, and then the colonialization of Oceania and Austronesia, or the Austronesian people groups, and on top of that as well, the cultural oppression and degradation of various other white ethnic groups within Europe, within the European continent itself, by said elitist, aristocratic monarchies. Well, there's the notion that after the turn of the after the turn of the 20th century, that just fizzled away. That's, and even amongst an amount more of falling leftist discourse, to even moderate leftists, that even though they may agree that mass oppressive and culturally disparaging forces societally are still around, they've taken on more of a subtle form, that they're not in as mass effect as they used to be. Well, all of that is complete nonsense. It's not true at all. There is numerous evidence of not only visible proof in the communities of where, in regards to non-white ethnicities, are predominant in the westernized world, but in regards to countries that where specific ethnic groups are predominant, that are non-white, that are predominant, or in regards to degraded portions of the white diaspora, where mass governmental influence from foreign white supremacist powers, predominantly white nations, has occurred, and economic influence, specifically in regards to the governmental influence. And also in said countries, cultural practices of that, similar to that of, or adopted, or most often more so, assimilated into by members of a different demographic, cultural background in that regard, more in favor of white cultural practices. This can be seen from the fact that, well, I'm just going to throw it all out at once here. So often in the business, private sector world, anything that isn't a suit and tie or a casual sweater, or sorry, I heard someone outside of my tent. Or that here, hold on. Lost my train of thought. Okay. Any fashion attire that is not suit and tie, a wool knitted sweater, khaki pants, a polo shirt, things of the sort. Attire such as, say, more low-riding pants or looser fitted hoodie wear, sweatpants, or any sort of jewelry that's more loose around the neck, or headdresses, more so do-rags, Islamic form headdresses, or Western African headdresses, or say pants that have more frills on the bottom, or made to resemble more of animal hide or of more leather design, or say sari of any kind of various Indian subcontinent fashion attire, or 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 in relation to the LGBTQ plus in regards to various ethnic groups, more clothes that displays more skin, that is more revealing overall, again looser fit, or more colorfully designed patterns that are in relation to, say, Eastern European ethnic groups that are have more block patterns to them, or more silked tops with slits in them. Anything such as that, well, it's just it's unprofessional. It's not appropriate. It's not proper, which in all realms is complete degradation. What that implies, as far as I'm concerned morally, is that the cultural attire is just improper to how well, someone is supposed to present themselves in terms of physical clothing, what is worn, being seen as so-called rugged. Same goes for any music that is not orchestral, more slow piano based, or okay. Sorry, there was just a passerby. I didn't want to disturb their very beautiful view of the river. My talking at that moment, at least. So anyway, music that well, any music that isn't what I mentioned, or more pop music, evolving out of ragtime and swing in that regard, things of the sort, and that would include degradation to music genres such as hip-hop and rap, more Arabian-style violin music, still orchestral, but prejudice towards it, or an over-exotification of it, or more traditional Chinese instrumentals or Mongolian-style instrumental equipment, string instruments again as well, or in relation to juke and dub, evolving, hip-hop and rap evolving out of that. Further, going back to, say, various African rain dance, Western African especially, rain dance music, or indigenous North American powwow ceremonial music, and etc. on and on. So, and not to mention the mass police brutality that persists worldwide within various municipal landscapes for complete communal control, and not just based for ethnic groups, but sorts of demographics, but in this regard, highly militarized, coordinated profiling and subjugating of these cultural expressions from being displayed more towards a predominant or even a minority white public of a country. And in that regard, another thing you can look at is the fact of the persistence in relation to neocolonialism, which is what we are in, an era of colonialization. The persistence of capitalist economy, which is in direct degradation of various different colony groups of peoples across the world and tribal groups that practiced in collectivist methods for community functionality, in more provably pseudo-anarchistic, maybe even you could classify them as early libertarian, and pseudo-communistic and socialistic practices, which much of this in relation to various, and again, this also includes white ethnicities in Europe who practice, European tribal groups that practiced in collectivism. This is where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels outlined this in the Communist Manifesto, and their own separate works in actually pointing to the functioning of previous demographics for communal sharing of resources and lack of, even though more there could be, you could argue, more monarchical structuring, which is authoritarian to some degree in regards to how it was, not concretely a monarchy though, in relation to, say, chiefdoms or any sort of designated leaders of a clan or of a tribal group of people. But even so, functioning with less of a set systematic structure, allowing for fluidity. So in that regard, on top of everything I stated before, you cannot do capitalism, fascism. You can't do it. Well, quite obviously, you cannot do blatant fascism without racism. Absolutely not. That's a defining principle of blatant fascism, especially in regards to branches of the ideology such as classical Nazism, neo-Nazism, and Hitlerianism. So, I guess you could also in that you can include Honeckerism of the Stalinist reformer Erich Honecker. But, well, or more neo-fascist economics of modern day, or neoliberal fascism, part of capitalism. But you, in relation to subtle fascism, specifically regarding capitalism, and in that as neoliberal fascism, you cannot do that without racial degradation. It is directly against non-problematic, provably so, communal structuring, cultural practices, neocultures that have formed out of ideologies formed out of initial cultures. It is complete degradation of such. It is murder to it's generations upon generations of trauma. And on top of that, in regards to the psychological effects that this has on populaces, ignored, as stated before, by healthcare communities around the world. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the internalization of people within these groups of prejudice towards them. And this, again, I outline this in my scientific proposals, but this doesn't just regard it doesn't just regard internalized racism, but in regard to that, internalized prejudice in all forms, the bigotry that is presented onto a demographic, is psychological trauma, mass psychological trauma, which can explain a variety of psychological disorders that form within individuals within these groups, and also explains various amounts of morally deplorable actions and ideologies that have been taken on by various collective groups and individuals within these different demographics as to why problematic cultural traditions have now come about, or again adorning the oppressive cultural traditions of the oppressor, in this regard relating to mass white supremacy. It's an explanation as to why, and it is highly destructive. Now, in that regard, I will state, I do believe there's this ridiculous notion that those of ethnic groups that have been oppressed by white ethnic of non-white ethnic groups who have been oppressed by white ethnic groups, that non-white ethnic groups cannot be racist towards white ethnic groups, which is completely wrong as far as I'm concerned. Not just solely on the basis of what would be considered the definition of racism overall, because that was created more so and outlined by various non-white academics and scholars. But in regards to that outlining of prejudice and bigotry from the oppressed ethnic groups towards a supremacist group, the definition and category is completely fitting of that for it's complete fitting for what the social attitudes and the psychological perception of the other group is from the oppressed group to be classified as the same in definition of racism. It's a ridiculous argument, I feel, considering as well many use the term sexist interchangeably for those of any gender who are prejudiced towards another, especially amongst the two cisgenders. Well, the term was more so outlined by cis women, various cis women researchers and social researchers, who, especially along with outlining the effects of mass societal misogyny on female demographic, the female populace, as well as that of transgender individuals and non-binary individuals too, in relation to the LGBTQ+. But so, in regards to that, men did not really define most of what is considered sexist historically, and the same goes for ethnic prejudice. So even in a structure that is dominant of, say, a white ethnic group, Western European, you can still be racist towards that other group via the gain prejudice. Because, but in that regard, as far as I'm concerned, most often, that prejudice, most often in the demographics, the oppressed non-white ethnicities, why that prejudice is gained is because of the uncompassionate, unempathetic subjugation and destruction of culture by white supremacist power structure. That's why. And there are other words in various languages as well to describe prejudice of similar context. That being, again, of non-white those of non-white ethnicity in terms of language origin. So there's that, and then there's one more thing on top of that. Oh yes, and to address this, so I want to also clear up just quickly, because it baffles me that people are really, well, all of it baffles me, but there are many people still confused about this, about what exactly white privilege means. Well, if anyone can define, if any of you out there know the term of what the idea of privilege is considered to be, well, then you know it's having a lot more ability to or accessibility to something, or having more. For this, sorry, I have a bit of a headache. It's either from the wind kicking up, causing the cold wind just causing some amount of a pressure headache, or an overstimulating pain sensors in my nerve fibers, or well, I'm not feeling tired, so maybe not from the not great sleep I had. Anyway, for this context, more leeway. I'll use the word leeway, having more leeway with something. In regards to white ethnic privilege, in dominant white supremacy in societal structuring, economically, governmentally, religiously, in terms of spiritualism, and all around culturally, socioculturally, what does that mean exactly? I'll define it for those who are confused and think it's a load of, who will use the argument of white people are oppressed too, even though that's not what most people who are arguing for the concept of white privilege are saying. Okay, what white privilege means is that even with the oppression of other white groups, since the outlining and elitist white cultural creation of race, or defining and separating race based especially upon skin color and cultural tradition, creating the differences for problematic and suppressive purposes. I've talked about this in another video before, that I don't think the fact that there are labels and distinctions for different groups, demographics, not just pertaining to ethnicity and nationality, are inherently a problem, because you can argue those have existed for a while, even before the creation of race. But regardless, in this regard, how this came about was for horrendous, morally atrocious purposes. But anyway, since that point in time, and since the mass spread of white supremacist ideals globally, with the vast spread of European colonialization, both outside Europe and inside Europe, in terms of other suppressed white ethnic groups, what it means is that in that structure, societally, even though if you're part of a elitist white faction of whatever realm, or a suppressed white group, most often what is heavily observed sociologically is that there is very clearly more leeway, there is a lot more leniency, and a lot more, well, key word, privilege. There's a lot less brutal, as extensively brutalizing subjugation in certain realms as non-white ethnic groups that are culturally suppressed within that structure. That doesn't mean or negate the oppression of those white ethnic groups, as it's just as morally deplorable, it's just as emotionally scarring and traumatizing and resource deprivating. But even in that regard, there is still very clearly, observably, leeway. There's favoritism there. There is still... Okay, let's use the most really readily available example I can come up with. Police brutality. Mass authoritarian police control. It is very clear that even in a situation of, say, false arrest, where an overly domineering, behaviorally domineering police officer, sociopathic and dominant police officer, is in a scenario of, say, detaining a white person, detaining a Latino person, say. There's very clear evidence that shows, because of, most likely, if the white person is adorned many cultural aspects of white background, that even with the harsh treatment there is more likely, in terms of that cultural bias, to be for the white subject. There's a good chance that there's going to be more leniency with how aggressive, how abrasive the officer is going to be to them, compared to that of the highly domineering, sociopathic, aggressive officer is towards the Latino subject, who adorns and practices much aspect of Latino culture, and more specifically, you could say more of Central American specific portions of the diaspora, cultural embracement, most likely because of said cultural bias, will be harsher in an arrest towards them. This is seen widespread. Okay, there's that. Hold on, let me just check something. Yeah, next day again. Got tied up with things. Okay, so it's clear to me this video is going to have to be 2 parts. It was dumb of me to think that I would be able to tackle everything I wanted to in this video, even with my attempts at well, just more so doing an overview of this, mainly being an overview of said stupid social myths. If you can't tell, today it's been an up and down day. Okay, so there'll be a part 2 to this. Hopefully soon enough. Depending on how the editing of this video goes. Because I gotta just work out some things again with my internal storage. And hopefully soon enough. Okay, so this was part 1 of Dispelling terrible, friggin' destructive ideas that major populaces still hold, and part 2 will be coming up soon enough.